quick. Just as a reminder for everybody, hopefully you know all why you are here. But this is one of the AESP Conversations with Giants, and we have Dr. Desmond Lawler here today. So Dr. Desmond Lawler is a professor emeritus of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. So Des spent about 41 years there at UT as a faculty member. He'll go into a little bit more kind of on his career, but really a lot of it was revolved around particles and water treatment and membrane technologies and other things to purify water. So Des really active throughout his career in things like AESP, AWWA, and a lot of other kind of Texas organizations and other things. So again, he'll get into more of this. I just wanted to kind of give you all an overview. Again, please feel free to participate. Either raise your hand, just unmute and speak, put a message into the chat, really whatever you feel comfortable with. We'd like to kind of keep this as conversational as possible. So if people can chime in kind of as we're going rather than waiting till the end, we think that will be quite helpful. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and maybe I'll give Des the opportunity to introduce himself and start going into some of his academic journey.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Stetson, for organizing this. It's really an honor for me to be involved in this. I don't know if I ever thought myself as a giant of the field, but it's nice to have somebody else give me that title. Yeah, so the brief outline of my academic journey is simple, I guess. I went to Notre Dame as an undergraduate, studied civil engineering. I got masters and PhDs at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I went directly from there to UT as an assistant professor and spent my entire career not only in the same department, but in the same office for the whole time. But actually, I wanted to give a little more background because I think it helps explain a bit about who I am and why I think the way I do in some cases. So I'm going to start with my family. I'm the youngest of 7 siblings. It turns out that my father was a civil engineer. My mother's father was also a civil engineer. My mother probably should have been a civil engineer, but in 1928 or the mid 1920s, when she was in college, there's no way a woman was going to take on civil engineering, I think. So she has a math major in college. So I grew up in a family, surrounded by bright people and ambitious people. My father died when I was 2, so I actually have no recollection of him at all. But so I was not only raised by my mother, but by my oldest few siblings. My oldest brother, John, is 12 and a half years older than I am. And he was in Manhattan College in New York. We lived about 25 or 30 miles from there. And he commuted, so he'd be home at night. And so when he was, say, a junior and taking his first course, which was then called sanitary engineering, not environmental engineering, I heard about activated sludge and things like that when I was 8 years old. And being the adoring little brother, I decided, hey, I want to be a civil engineer. And I pretty much followed that, all through high school. And I would say, if people say what you want to be, I'd say, oh, I want to be a civil engineer. Not, of course, having much idea what it meant. So then I went to Notre Dame and signed up for civil engineering. And about sophomore year, I thought, I hate this stuff. I really was not enjoying studying civil engineering very much, but I spent almost all of my sophomore year looking at other majors, from math to physics to theology to philosophy to English, everything under the sun. And it finally occurred to me by the end of my sophomore year that the only way I could graduate in 4 years was to get my degree in civil engineering. So I resigned myself to doing that, and took as many other courses as I could, which is not very many in those days. Of course, civil engineering curricula were highly constrained. So anyway, I got a degree in civil engineering, and when I walked across the stage with my diploma, I thought, okay, that was that. I'll never do civil engineering again. And this period, so I was in college from 1964 to 1968, ancient history to some of you on the call. And I had that was during the height of the Vietnam War era, and when you were, Notre Dame was all male at the time, and when you were a male in those days in college, you had to think about what you thought about war because people were getting drafted at that point. And I realized that war was not something that I really believed in, and I became a conscientious objector and applied to my draft board and learned a lot about that. So when I graduated, I ended up getting a job at the Newman Center, the Catholic Student Center at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And when I got there, like immediately, I learned that they were going to, that somebody was teaching a course in draft counseling. I ended up becoming a draft counselor and for actually the next several years. Um, and so I did a lot of counseling during that time. In any case, after about 4 years, so I was doing a lot of legal work and I was doing a lot of counseling work with draft counseling. And at the end of 4 years, I was getting a little burned out and decided I should think about what I wanted to do next. And I took a job painting a house so that I had plenty of time to think about what I wanted to do. And when I climbed up the ladder the first day, I thought I was going to decide between going to law school or going to school in counseling psychology. Uh, and of course, in the next couple of weeks, I realized, well, I'm kind of burned out doing what I'm doing. And what am I doing but law and counseling? So maybe that's not a good idea. So from having two options, I went to zero in a course of a few weeks. And then I decided, well, I actually was pretty darn good at engineering, even though I wasn't loving it. Maybe I should give that a try. And the only part of it that I had enjoyed was environmental engineering. And so I decided to look for a job in environmental engineering. And it took me a couple months, but I got a job working for the city of Kansas City. All of this was in Kansas City, Missouri. And took a job with the city of Kansas City in their air pollution department. And and I loved it. And I had a really good time. My job was mostly to get this was again, it was in the early days of EPA. Okay, so there was a lot of work to be done. My job was to go around to all the industries in town and make sure they were in compliance with the rules. And I learned a lot. I really enjoyed the learning, uh, and I think I really helped the city do that. But I also kind of realized that I was going to get bored pretty quickly with that, and I decided, gee, maybe I should go to graduate school. And so I decided to apply to graduate school and ended up at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Um, and I went there thinking, well, I know I want a master's degree, I'll contemplate a PhD. And um, it was, I think it probably took like 3 weeks, and I realized, oh, academia is the place for me. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And so I committed myself really early on to getting a PhD and going on into academia. And all these years later, that was a really good decision. Um, and so one of the things that I think really I've thought about from time to time is that I think people with good education have a lot of options about what they can do. And I think that for me, what academia did was kind of take advantage of a lot of who I am and not just a little bit of who I am. It had the intellectual work of being, the research and teaching and whatever. It had the opportunity to do counseling basically or teaching with students that I really enjoyed. And so, it became who I was. And then, of course, I spent 41 years, as I said, in the same office and, uh, had, I don't know, about 100 master students work with me and about 33 or 35 PhD students work with me over the time. And then, of course, I taught undergraduate as well. So that's kind of the outline. I do think that the family background and the experience of working as a non-engineer really helped shape a lot of what I thought about and how I proceeded doing my work in academia once I finally got there.
Thanks, Des. It's amazing to hear the twists and turns that led you to academia. Um, The next questions, like you kind of alluded to, we want to try and cover kind of the three legs of teaching, or three legs of teaching, research, and service that every faculty kind of has drilled into them from when they start their first faculty position. There might be some new faculty on the call, or maybe future faculty on here. And you really strongly value both undergrad and grad teaching, throughout your career. Can you tell us a little bit about your philosophy of teaching, please?
Sure, that's something I've thought about a lot, um, and happy to try to share some of those thoughts I've had over the years about that. Um, I guess the first thing I've thought about teaching is that I think teaching uh, a good teacher has to be both personally supportive of the students as well as intellectually challenging to the students, and I actually think that good teaching is pretty much the same from kindergarten through graduate school in that regard. And you know what constitutes an intellectual challenge to a kindergartner and what kind of support they need is maybe different than what is true for a junior in college or a graduate student. But I do think that those two legs are equally valuable at all stages of education. Um, and I think that that's what I try to embody in my teaching. And I think a lot of college teachers basically don't believe in, or maybe explicitly don't believe in the personally supportive part of that. But to me, it was an important part of how I thought about teaching. And by teaching in that regard, I mean not just in the classroom, but throughout the experience of interacting with students in and out of the classroom, in research or in the hallway or whatever. With respect to the actual class time, I had this kind of mantra that I would think about a lot when I was teaching, which was class time is thinking time. And I tried to structure every class period as an opportunity to not only think myself, but to engage students in a way that they would be thinking. So it was not just a dump of PowerPoint slides or whatever, and hope the students figured it out later. It was I always tried to make sure I structured the class in a way that people would be thinking. And there's several of you on the call who had me in class, and you might remember that I would ask a lot of questions myself to students. Um, Sometimes just out of the blue, I'd be in the midst of something and I would pose a question, an intellectual question related to the subject matter, and then I might say, Stetson, what do you think about that? And Stetson would kind of the first person you called on would often freeze and maybe make some decent effort at it, or maybe not. But what it did was it allowed everybody else in the class a chance to really think about it, and then I could call on somebody else, and you could read the faces pretty well of who had some ideas and who maybe didn't. And depending on you know how I wanted to deal with it, I might call on somebody else who would look really confused, or I might call on somebody who looked like they really had it. And in after a while, I did that a lot in my early teaching, and I really did it throughout. But in the later years, I kind of to take some of the pressure off individuals, I would often ask people to talk about it in groups of two or three or four. The friends and neighbors is the expression that I would use in class. Talk this over with your friends and neighbors and tell me what you think. And then I would call on somebody in the group and ask them what their group thought, which it took some of the personal pressure off individuals, but still did the same thing of getting everybody thinking. And the other thing I would do, essentially every single class, I would start by asking who had questions. And that often didn't result in any questions, but sometimes it did. And and sometimes they'd be, very specific about a homework question, and I would probably, maybe give some hint or try to defer that to office hours or whatever. Or if I felt like, sometimes it asks explicitly, do a lot of people in the class have that question, or is it just this one student? And if a lot of people had the same thing, then, we'd spend some time thinking about it. But so those were a couple of the thoughts that really kind of guided a lot of my teaching. And I guess I really think of what we do as education, not as teaching in a sense. And so in that regard, I think one of the things that comes up about engineering is teaching what's common practice or kind of going beyond that. And I always felt like the most practical knowledge was really a great understanding of theory. And so I always tried to emphasize theory, even in my undergraduate classes. I would often try to make sure, I got below the surface to get people to try to understand why things work the way they do, and not just, or why we did things the way we do, rather than just that we did it. So I spent a lot of time thinking about, underlying principles, and we try to teach those underlying principles at every level. So those are some of the thoughts that guided me a lot. I guess the only other thing that comes to me is, closely related, is mentoring, which happened not only, or not so much in the classroom, but other times as well. And I think that's kind of closely related, and gave me the opportunity to help try to develop how people think, and how they go about approaching problems. So all of those things kind of wrap together, I think. I was always trying to push for greater understanding in the students' minds.
Very nice. Thanks for that, Des. I think all of us that had you in class can attest to the intellectually challenging and the personal support. So it's very much appreciated. But I guess thinking more broadly, outside of the classroom and outside of the university, I think all of us, or a lot of us on this call, will recognize the textbooks that you wrote with Mark Benjamin. So the water quality engineering text that a lot of us have used throughout our learning. So what did that experience kind of provide to you or teach you about how to portray these ideas?
Oh boy. Well, it was a grand and lengthy experience writing the book. um, so the book took quite a number of years to get to the point of publication. And during that time, it was being used at several universities. We would send chapters that were finished to, or nearly finished, to other professors and ask them to try it out in their classes. And so we got good feedback that way. I think the motivation for me was, I felt like I was pretty successful as a classroom teacher, and I kind of wanted to, uh, kind of provide that experience to a lot more students than I could do that through writing a textbook. And I think Mark felt pretty much the same way about that. One interesting thing is, and this gets to the heart of your question there, Mark and I had many, many similarities, but we also had some differences in how we approached things and how we thought about things and how we learned things. So one of the things that we realized in writing the book was that combining both of those things kind of expanded the value of the book, or the accessibility of the book, to people who learn in different ways. So like I'm much more mathematical and graphical. I mean, this is a simplification, okay, but I'm more mathematical and more graphical and more than Mark is, and he's more word oriented and uh, and kind of conceptual thinking. And he would kind of get to understand the math by understanding the concepts, and I would get to understand the concepts by understanding the math. And again, that's an oversimplification, but the fact that we had differences in approach, and that we would work till we both agreed that something was right, uh, was really helpful in getting things done. Now, I know the book is not easy, uh, and in some cases, maybe is a little verbose or maybe a lot verbose. But we worked hard to make sure that we both agreed on everything that was in the text and how it was done, and etc. So, but I just want to interject for a second. If there are faculty on the call who are using the book and have been told by Wiley that there's no solution manual, which I know Wiley has told people, it's not true. There is a solution manual. And if you email me, I will send it to you if you're a faculty member that's using the book. So that would be, that would, I'd be delighted to provide that. It was weird that Wiley insisted that they wouldn't accept the book until we had a full solution manual. And so when we sent in all the chapters, we also sent in a complete solution manual, and somehow they lost track of that. So in any case, I'm happy to share that with faculty members who are using the book. But the book was a very challenging experience, but a great one. I guess one of the other things I want to say about that is, Mark and I agreed early on that we wanted to make sure the book was, pretty much at an even intellectual level throughout the entire book. And there were some things, of course, that I knew well and better than he did at the start, and similarly, he knew things better than I knew at the start, and whatever. But there were other areas that neither one of us knew very much about, or at least didn't know at the same level that we did other things, and we pushed ourselves pretty hard to get to the point that those areas where we hadn't had much experience or much knowledge and not done any research, that we would get to the point that the book would be even in that regard. And for me, a couple of those things that I remember spending a lot of time on learning was flotation. I had done a lot of work on all kinds of particle processes, but I'd never done anything on flotation. And electrodialysis was another one that I basically knew nothing about, and we knew it had to go in the book, and I took that on, and Mark took on some other things as well. But anyway, I just remember, I loved the experience in some ways. It was like being a PhD student again, where you're doing literature review and trying to figure out how things work and whatever. And I felt really good about that process. It was one reason why the book took a long time, because something like the flotation chapter, I think I spent all summer becoming knowledgeable enough about flotation to be able to write whatever it is, 15 pages in the book about flotation. So anyway, that's some of the experiences of writing the book. And obviously it's something I'm pretty proud to have done.
Thanks, Des. Yeah, it was incredible, to think back to your class, and that class time was definitely thinking time. I remember working, really hard trying to scribble down everything I could as quickly as possible, all the little nuggets. And I remember one time I had to borrow a pen, but the person I borrowed it from only had like a traditional ink pen, and I had never written with that before, and that was like the most challenging thing, trying to work through with that. The other thing I remember from your class, and I assume you kept it going, is I think every test was always basically a new test that you developed. And questions were from, maybe a conference you were just at or something like that. And I thought that was always just a really interesting experience. And now as a faculty, I realize like how hard that is to develop those questions and put those together.
Yeah, um, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, exams were really challenging to make up. I didn't always make up all new problems, but I always tried to make sure that there was at least one new substantive problem on every exam I made up. It was partly for my own intellectual challenge, and partly to keep things current. And yeah, it's true that I would often make those up based on a recent published article or uh, something I had heard at a conference or whatever. One of the ones I remember in that regard was a couple of things, just funny stories come to mind. One was I think it was a call. I don't think it was an email. I got it, might have been either one, but anyway, from somebody at NASA. And it was about settling uh, basically, you know, in outer space. Um, and or on the moon, or yeah, I guess it was on the moon or something like that. And anyway, I made up a problem about that. And to be able to solve the problem, you had to remember absolute basic physics. You know what the meaning of velocity is, what the meaning of acceleration is, uh, and I remember some student gave me a really hard time that it was unfair that I had asked them to remember that. And I thought, okay, that's really really basic science that any engineer should know that uh, velocity is, you know, the change in distance over time, and acceleration is change in velocity over time, but with respect to time. And anyway, those were some of the examples. One of the ones that's this is embarrassing, but one of the ones I made up from a article that was published. I asked a question in a way that proved to be impossible. Um, and I thought I had a solution when I made it up. Obviously, I wouldn't have put it on if I didn't think I had a solution. But I myself had made a mistake. And when when I figured this out by the time I was grading, and one of the students who took the exam, uh, basically on the exam itself said, "This is impossible." And after doing a lot of work and whatever, and it was embarrassing to go in and say, "Okay, I blew this one." But on the other hand, uh, it taught people that we can all make mistakes, and that working at the edge of your knowledge is probably a good thing. So I was embarrassed, but I also felt like it wasn't such a bad lesson. And yes, it is difficult. And yes, it takes time.
So many of the folks here, I think, have either been in your class or been one of your students directly through research, and I'm sure everybody can attest to say that you have a real way of making every student feel like the most important person, kind of in that room, or the most important person you're working with. Um, I guess, can you tell us a little bit about where that instinct kind of comes from, and then how do you decide how much of yourself as a mentor or as an educator to give to one student?
Well, that's quite a statement, but thank you. Um, the fact is, I really like working with students throughout. Um, and I also have to say that my wife, Alice, some of you know her, is a counseling psychologist. I learned a lot from her about uh, how to approach students, how to deal with uh, various kinds of things. And so I learned a lot from her. Um, I, I just felt like everybody who was in my classes deserved to be there, certainly in our graduate program in research deserved to be there. We spent At the graduate level, we spent a long time on admissions and made sure that everybody who was admitted was, going to make it. And even at the undergraduate level, especially, in the last half of my career, it's hard to get into University of Texas at Austin as an undergraduate. And so, every student in my classes was quite well qualified. And the fact is, I pretty much only taught juniors and seniors after the first few years I was there. And so these are students that had kind of proven that they belonged. so it was kind of easy to really believe in the students there. And um, so I guess I just learned to pay attention to what a student had to say, and to try to um, bring out the best in them throughout. So um, yeah, and you use the word instinct, and I guess some of it was instinct. Um, you know, learning how to read people, learning how to interact with people. One of the things I didn't mention way back in high school, I went to high school in New York City, which is 25 or 30 miles from where we lived, and I used to hitchhike home every day. So I learned how to speak to strangers uh, in that regard. And so, I learned how to interact with students pretty well. And basically, I just really believed in students that we had. Just sometime in the last 6 months, I went to a local chapter meeting of the AWWA, and one woman who I had in class, I didn't have her in research at all. She hung around afterwards just to thank me, and she said, "You did so much for me." And I said, I barely knew this woman, and I had only had her in class. I hadn't had any other interaction with her. And I said to her, I didn't do anything. And she said, "You believed in me." And I thought, oh wow, that's a powerful statement. And basically, I did believe in students, and that's maybe what you're referring to, and making people feel like uh, they were the most important in the room.
Thanks, Des. I think a lot of us that interacted with you, right, feel like you had a very good way of interacting with us. And the one that I guess we're going to transition to, and the one that I think about quite a lot, is as soon as you walk into the Lawler lab, you see that poster of the Lawler's three rules. So we're going to kind of talk through your reasoning and your, um, I guess the reasoning for including those rules. So the first one, that for those of you that aren't aware of them, the first Lawler rule is when in doubt, perform a mass balance. So maybe Des, could you talk through kind of why that's your first rule and how you kind of get students to be in that mindset?
First of all, I'll tell you when I first thought about that. So when I was a PhD student, um, we had to take comprehensive exams, after a few years of being in the program. And at North Carolina, at the time, there were not very many PhD students. It was mostly a master's program, serious research master's program, and a small number of PhD students. So, and especially in the treatment area, there hadn't been too many in recent years. And the previous person who took that comprehensive exam, to me, had failed the exam. And he was allowed to retake it and did fine, and he's had a wonderful career since. But anyway, I went into studying for that exam uh, with a fair amount of fear, and I basically did nothing but study for that exam for 2 months. And and I when I started, it was like I want to be like ready to take the final exam in every class I've ever had. And pretty quickly, after a few weeks, I realized I I I can't memorize. I'm just not a very good memorizer. I can't do this. And that's when it first started to occur to me that, oh, all this stuff fits together really well. And it all comes down to doing the right mass balance and working from that, you there. So that idea came to me in studying for my comprehensive exams as a PhD student. And so when I started teaching, it just kind of came to me naturally naturally because of the experience I had, that okay, this is what we're going to do in this class. We're going to learn how to write the right mass balance for all these different situations and treatment processes and whatever that we're in. So yeah, I used to say that all the time in class: when in doubt, do a mass balance. And on my exams, I would often have the instructions would be, whatever they would be for a particular exam, and then the last one would always be, when in doubt, dot dot dot, because I knew students would know what was meant by that. And usually I asked questions on those exams that required people to write a mass balance that they hadn't necessarily seen in the same way before. And therefore I knew that they'd be in doubt. So Lawler rule number one is really environmental engineering rule number one. When in doubt, do a mass balance. And of course, it could be an energy balance, and it could be, momentum balance or whatever. But for those of us in the treatment world, it's usually a mass balance. So to me, it was Lawler rule number one because it's environmental engineering basic rule. And Lawler rule number two had really nothing to do with technical work. It was don't leave the university until you're finished. And finished meant that your thesis or dissertation had been handed into the graduate school and signed by the faculty. And I came to that because early on when I was at UT, I realized that a lot of people were leaving and taking jobs before they were finished. And they, when I first started, I thought it would take people 5 times as long to finish. If they had a month left of work to do, they would take 5 months. But then with experience, I realized, no, it was more like 10. And then with more experience, I realized it was more like 15. And so I used to drill into people right at orientation. I think today is the orientation for graduate students at UT. And I used to, my little session on that, I would start with that. It would be Lawler rule number 2. I'd tell them they have to take my class to Lawler rule number 1. But I'd say Lawler rule number 2 is don't leave until you're finished. And I would define what I meant by that. Just within the last few days, I was with a student who reminded me he never took my class. He was already finished coursework when I started in January 1980. And he had left to take a job. But students had to continuously register for thesis hours until they were finished. And I became graduate advisor after, I guess, just 3 years or something like that. So he came in to have me sign this thing that he was allowed to take, or that he was signed up for thesis. And he reminded me of the story that I told him, I'm not going to sign this again. I can't believe I had the nerve to tell him that. I said, you need to finish this semester because I'm not going to sign this again. You need to finish. And he did. And he was grateful forevermore that I had forced him to do it. So that was Lawler rule number 2. And I had, I pretty much all my students kept to that. And then Lawler number, I have to thank Shane Walker for elevating this third one to a Lawler rule. But I used to say it all the time to especially my research students. And it was, if you're putting in the time, you're making progress. And, I think I certainly had it myself as a PhD student, and for that matter, many times as a faculty member, that you're trying to do research and you're stuck and you don't understand something and you're putting, you're working. And I came to realize that, that's part of the process, is that you go through a process of being lost and you feel like you're not making any progress at all. And so I would tell students, if you're putting in the time, you're making progress. And I would also say the reverse is also true. If you're not putting in the time, you're not making progress. Because it's easy when you're stuck to just kind of give up. I'm not making any progress. I'm just not going to do anything. I'm going to go do whatever. And I would really encourage people to, with that basically mantra, if you're putting in time and making progress, to get students to believe that they were making progress. And sure enough, they did. There's a word that I used to use a lot too, in my own mind anyway, that I felt like a lot of my role as a research advisor was to be a cheerleader. You know, that my role was to, you know, do what cheerleaders do. They get people to believe that, you know, scoring the next goal or the next touchdown or the next basket is possible. And I felt like my role as a faculty research mentor was to be a cheerleader. And part of that was you're putting in the time, you're making progress. So there they are in a nutshell. Lawler's 3 rules.
Kind of building on that cheerleader and kind of building up as a mentor and building up a community. We wanted to ask a little bit about kind of the EWRE program specifically. You really built the EWRE program at UT, kind of into what it is today, starting with hiring faculty and finding students. And, you mentioned that how important recruiting students has been to you. Kind of looking back, what do you think it actually takes to build kind of this lasting intellectual community? And then, do you think you did some things that were intentional that did, really well? Do you think a lot of that was, or part of it was luck? And then, for maybe some of the folks on the call here, what would you tell us, or tell someone that's trying to build that kind of community now at their institutions?
I don't think much of it was luck, I'll say that. um, and I also want to say that it certainly wasn't only me who built the program, but I do think I had a lot to do with building the spirit of community in the program that I think really became a hallmark of it in time. When I interviewed here, I specifically, which is, March of 1979, talk about ancient history. I specifically asked to meet with graduate students without any faculty being present because I wanted to get a feel for, where they were. And now this might have been a self-selective process of who came, but boy, did I get an earful about how terrible things were and whatever. And I really got the sense that students felt mistreated by the faculty. And I felt like, wow, and the North Carolina experience that I was involved with at that time was quite the opposite. And I just felt like I could make a difference. I could make a difference if I took the job here, that I could change the sense of students' experience in the program. And so I purposely went about that. I was, very student oriented from the first day. I said something at a faculty meeting of the environmental faculty about 3 or 4 months after I was here, and one of the senior faculty basically barked at me, "This is not the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This is the University of Texas." And I went, "Well, okay." But I basically had a lot to do with changing the spirit of our program and how students would experience the program. And part of that was I worried a lot about what faculty we hired, and even as assistant professor, I made sure I participated in that and tried to make sure we hired faculty who would care about their students, and and we did that. But lots of other faculty, after we hired Lynn Katz, she was very much 100% the same as me in that regard, and others too, Kerry Kenny, whatever. But so that was an important thing, and I do think it takes faculty effort. It takes being mindful about what you're doing and working hard to make sure it happens, and not be afraid of going into some faculty member's office and saying, "Hey, you really blew it with this student," and this is how they experience things, and you need to kind of try to patch that up. So But that's not very necessary usually. But always appealing to the faculty that keeping what's best for the students in mind is always always a good idea.
Lee, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, hey Des. Wanted to kind of build on this question a little bit here. As Stetson said, and I think many of us agree wholeheartedly. You were really cultural leader at UT Austin in the department, the EWRE program. Um, One thing I'm curious about, like I think a lot of times there's cultural leaders, institutions eventually end up becoming department chair. I think it was a conscientious decision on your side to not do that. And so can you tell us like a little bit of why you decided not to go that route and why you thought maybe you would have bigger impact or better impact or the type of impacts that you wanted, kind of not in that department leadership role?
Thanks, Lee, for the question. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Um, yeah, I probably could have become department chairman. There were, a few times that job would come available every once in a while. Um, and I know that my name was mentioned often as a possible person to do that. There was one time where, the committee just kind of pulled the faculty, tell us who would be in there, and apparently my name came up a lot, along with a couple of others, and so they said, okay, we're going to formally interview these three people, and I go into my interview, and the chairman of the committee says, well, our first question is, why do you want to be the department chair? And I said, I never said I wanted to be department chair. I said I'd be happy to do it if people want me to do it, but it's not something I've pursued and whatever. Lee, I don't think I'd be a very good administrator, to be perfectly honest. I think I think I'm a good leader. I think I'm a good informal leader. Uh, I think I did a lot to impact the culture of not just the EWRE program, but the entire Department of Civil Engineering. Um, but I never was convinced that it would be the best thing that I could do. And I guess part of it too was I know that being department chair would take me away from working with students and put me more working all the time with faculty. And I guess I wasn't willing to give that up. You know, if that time, or actually two or three times, I was kind of in a position where probably if I had pushed it, I might have been considered, or I might have been asked to do the job. But I just never really wanted it. And of course, I also think a lot of times people who want it, a lot of the other faculty don't want them to have the job. Um, but I don't know. It's just something I think it fits certain people. Jerry Spitel got the job at a time when when the process started. I don't think a lot of people thought that he would be the chair, and he really wanted it. And he went into those meetings and proved that he was the best. And he turned out to be a spectacular administrator and was great. Um, and he wanted it. He knew he had those skills. Uh, Not something that ever really appealed to me. But more power to people who want it and who are good at it. I mean, I definitely appreciate that good academic leadership at the chair level, at the dean level is very, very valuable. I don't think it was a big part of my skill set. And great to see you as well, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, for chiming in. I guess at this point, just due to the sake of time, we have maybe about 10 minutes left, and we want to be cordial to everybody's next commitments. So if anybody has questions or comments and want to raise their hand or just unmute and speak, you're more than welcome to. I know, Jaime, you had put a question into the Google form, so I'm happy to read that, or if you want to share it yourself, that's perfectly fine. Sure. Yeah, I can go ahead. So Des, I may had kind of brought the idea of the declining political attention to environmental issues and some of the challenges that some of our graduates may face. So kind of just a forward-looking question, where do you see environmental engineering heading? And in particular, kind of some of the water-related challenges we may face.
Yeah, Jaime, first of all, hello, and thank you for the question. It's nice to see you all the way from Colombia. That's impressive. But anyway, um, well, I will say, first of all, in terms of the current political climate, not just in the U.S., but in a lot of places around the world, yes, there is a declining interest in the environment politically. And I certainly wouldn't love to be an assistant professor right now, having, you know, grants that were approved being taken back and whatever, which happened to a few of our faculty here, and I know it happened to a lot of people. So that's really difficult. But in the long view, you know, I think people care about the environment. And I think that this current kind of rollback will not last. And that in the long run, people care a lot about the environment, and the pendulum will swing back, and there will be robust funding of environmental protection again. So I'm very optimistic about that in the long term, and I don't mean 50 years. I mean, you know, 5 years, 10 years, something like that, maybe even faster. So I'm not, so I'm optimistic about that. The challenge is, climate change is really wreaking havoc on on the world right now. Uh, and so I think, I think about my water resources colleagues who, would often talk about what they worry about is droughts and floods. Uh, and I do think that the challenges brought on by climate change for water supply and the quality of water are really critical. And the population rising also makes for huge challenges. So, I mean, we've certainly seen in the US, for example, the idea of recycling wastewater to make drinking water, which, when I was in graduate school, which is now a long time ago, um, nobody would think about that. It was like, and if somebody did raise the idea, it would be like, no way, nobody would ever agree to that or whatever. And now, in drought places of the country and highly in places where population is growing dramatically, as in Texas, where I am, it's not only become thinkable, but it's happening. And so I think that's one of the challenges and it's both a technical challenge and a cultural challenge. Um, but I think that we're meeting that. And how we deal with climate change in the water industry as well as in the energy industry, I think is just a huge challenge coming for us. And I'm optimistic that we have good engineers and we'll solve these problems. And I'm optimistic that culturally we'll get to the point that we decide it's important enough to do it to spend money on it. So in the long run, I'm very optimistic. In the short run, life's not great right now.
Nice. Thanks, Des, for that outlook. Maybe we'll just take the last few minutes to give you a chance, maybe to, instead of looking forward, look back a little bit. So think about your career a little bit. Like, what are you most proud of in what you've done as an educator and a professor at UT?
I guess I'll point to two things. First thing is I'm really proud of what our students have done. Um, you know, I've had something in the mid-30s of PhD students, and about 2/3 of them have gone into academia. And that's something I'm really proud of. It makes me think I must have made this life look pretty good because a lot of my students decided to follow me into the field. But I'm equally proud of the ones who decided not to go into academia and have done great work in research and consulting and whatever. And in that regard, I also just want to point out the master's students who have just gone on to do amazing work. I mean, it turns out that three of my personal, master's students, graduates, one of them was co-supervised with Jerry Spitell, are now the directors of major water systems, including Austin. Shay Rolson is the director of Austin Water. She was a master's student here with me and Jerry. Annika Bankston, then Annika Van Gelder, is, I'm not sure of her title, but she's, if not at the very top, but the very top echelon of people in Minneapolis. And Kim Madoc is in the same position in the city of Tacoma in Washington. So our students have done great work, and if I had a role in that, I'm proud of it. I also think that one of the things about admissions is if you bring really great students in, you turn great students out. So I can't necessarily claim a lot. And and I guess the other thing that I'd point to is the great book, which is it's something I spent a long time on. I think it's really valuable to the field. I hope it's really valuable to the field. And I think it was a contribution that I tried to make instead of just worrying about my classroom, worry about classrooms all over the country and all over the world. And if it fits that bill, I'm certainly proud of it. So those are the two biggest things that I think of. And there's lots of research articles, which I'm proud of as well. But in the big picture, those two things are the things that I think about the most.
Very nice. Thank you, Des. So yeah, I think that more or less kind of wraps up our webinar today. I welcome anybody to stick around if they have any comments or anything or want to quickly chat with Des, or feel free to send him a note. I think he would appreciate it. But I think I want to just take a moment and thanks Des for doing this. I think all of us definitely appreciate all this insight you just provided to us. And we're very appreciative. I think a lot of us, right, or some former students are very appreciative to everything you've done through us throughout your career. So thank you, Des. And thanks everybody for joining. This webinar again will be posted on YouTube and everything. It might take us a few days to do so, but thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you for the next round of these conversations.
Well, and I just want to thank you, Matt and Stetson, for coming up with this idea, and thank all of you for attending. It's been a great opportunity for me, and I'll shrink back to being a normal human being now that I'm no longer a giant. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
Hey, Des, have you thought of adding a fourth rule? Are you open to a fourth rule?
I'm always open, Ann.
I think this really got me thinking that the fourth rule should be something like, you're never really done. Because I feel like we're all still a community and the environmental issues keep going. So I think you should ponder some kind of fourth rule that makes people realize even when they leave, they're not finished.
That's a good thought. Yeah. The intellectual life continues, the research continues,
The mentoring, you never get rid of us.
I'm happy not to get rid of my students, I tell you that. I had very good relations with essentially all of them, and I cherish those relationships very much.